Guest, Khosh Ahmadid. I'm glad everyone could be here today. If everyone could just make sure their cell phones are off, sorry. I'm a fellow here at New America Foundation. My name is Nicholas Schmidl, and it is an honor to be able to come here and moderate this panel this afternoon, as it kind of represents me having come full circle at New America from a year and a half ago, when Steve organized a very impromptu breaking news panel about Pakistan. I had just been kicked out of Pakistan 48 hours before Steve hosted the panel. He gave me a seat. I then came back. I've just written a book, To Live or to Perish Forever. It's available at Amazon.com and your local bookstores. But, you know, Iran has always held a very special place in my heart. In the summer of 2004, I was a student at the University of Tehran. I was living in the very dormitories that on the second night of the protests were stormed. And you know, during that summer, I traveled all over the country, had a number of minor epiphanies, but one minor epiphany that I had that is now sort of bearing itself out for audiences all over the world to see is this vast, vast divide between the attitudes of ordinary Iranians and the policies and the attitudes of the regime. There was a Friday when I attended the sort of legendary Friday prayers at Tehran University. And since I wasn't there as a journalist and I was there as a student, I sat amongst the Iranians, and I was there with an Iranian friend, and you know, these are where they usually chant death to America and whatnot. So I go in with this Iranian friend, and he says to me, all right, when we get inside, you're to tell anyone who looks like they can ask for ID that you're Swedish. And anyone who looks like they don't have the authority to ask for ID, you can, you know, or no, anyone who doesn't have the authority, you tell them you're Swedish. Anyone who asks for an ID, you tell them you're an American. So we're sitting there, and they begin chanting death to America. And I, at one point, excused myself at the end of the chanting because the prayers were going to begin. And at this point, it was going to become very awkward when everyone started bowing that I was actually not Swedish, not a Muslim, not supposed to be there, etc. And I started sliding out the back door, and there was a guy standing there with a metal detector wand who stopped me and asked me, you know, who are you and where are you going and where are you from? And, you know, my heart was beating out of my neck, and I said, well, I'm an American, and they're chanting Marg Bar America, death to America in the background. And this guy says, oh, America, very good, it's so nice to have you here. So, you know, this divide, though, has now manifested itself for all the world to see over the past week and a half. And so it is a great honor to be able to be here and to moderate this incredibly informative and hopefully lively panel. What we want to do today is to add a little context, a little history, a little background to the Twitter feeds and the blogs and the sort of the short, immediate postings that we've been reading for the past week. And so what I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do is just to talk for 5-6 minutes, no longer than that. I'll introduce each of you at 7 minutes in the flavor of Steve Clemens. I will cut people off, and then we'll move on. And then we can double back and do a little question, then we'll open up to the floor. I'm going to try and proceed to try and make sense of this as much as possible. I'm going to proceed chronologically, and I will start then with Ken Ballin. Ken is the president of Terror Free Tomorrow, which has conducted a number of extremely influential polls over the past several years, including one leading up to the Pakistani parliamentary elections last year that in many ways handicapped the government's ability to rig the poll when it came out showing that the Musharraf party was going to lose. So Ken's polls have been extremely influential. And so I'm just going to ask Ken to talk a little bit about their polling, finding an analysis, and lead up to the article that you all wrote on June 15th.
Thank you, Nick. First, he did write a wonderful book. I've read it, and you should buy it. So there you go. It's a really great book. And we do a lot of work in Pakistan, so his book provides a very meaningful context for understanding the events in Pakistan today, though I know everyone's here about Iran. First, let me echo Nick's remarks that there's a real divide between the attitudes of the Iranian people and the regime. We conducted a poll in Iran which concluded 3 weeks before the election. And the most important thing we found in that poll, and the thing to take away, which helps provide necessary context to what's occurring in Iran right now, is that Iranians overwhelmingly want a truly democratic system inside Iran. Think of this. They picked as their top 3 priorities for their government improving the economy, well, there's no surprise there, but almost as high, ensuring free elections and ensuring a free press. And 77% of Iranians said they want to be able to vote for the supreme leader, who, as now everyone here probably knows, is unelected. They want the opportunity to vote. So across the spectrum, they're asking for democracy. And here's the most important fact. 86% of the people who said they would vote for Ahmadinejad, they supported his re-election, also chose ensuring free elections, ensuring a free press, voting for the supreme leader as their top priorities, along with the economy for their government. So there's a consensus in Iran today, and that consensus is they want a democratic system. This is Ahmadinejad supporters as well. We showed Ahmadinejad 3 weeks out from the election, leading by a 2-to-1 margin, 34% to 14% for Mr. Mousavi. But even among Ahmadinejad supporters, they wanted a fully democratic system. These were their priorities. So right now, the regime's response to this election has shifted the nature of what's happening in Iran, and the regime risks alienating their own supporters. People who wanted to vote for them no longer may share their goals given the response, which I'm sure others here will address more specifically. Now, there's been a lot of, unfortunately, misunderstanding of our poll. We did not predict the election results. It was concluded 3 weeks before the election. It did not, by its very nature, account for a surge for Mousavi, which a lot of knowledgeable commentators feel occurred in Iran. So we did not predict the result. We did show a substantial lead for Ahmadinejad. That is a relevant fact. If we had shown that Mousavi was leading by a 2-to-1 margin 3 weeks out, that would be a relevant fact too. I wish we had shown that, but we showed what we showed, and we have to call them as we see them. The important fact, though, is what Iranians want among both Ahmadinejad supporters and non-Ahmadinejad supporters. So the government is risking losing their base, not only people who voted against them in this election. So I think that is the big takeaway, and that is the point I want to emphasize, because as we move forward, this is not becoming just about who won or who lost, but what kind of country Iranians have and what Iranians want. They want better relations with the United States. This is not our first poll in Iran. Over the past 2 years, we've conducted 3 nationwide surveys. Our first poll in 2005 was the first poll done since a very famous poll in 2002 inside Iran, where the pollster who conducted the poll was jailed. So we have experience with this.
Can you pull the mic closer to you, possibly?
Yeah. I don't have to repeat everything I just said, though, to Steve. Well, all right, I'll repeat it in one sentence. It doesn't matter for 86% of Ahmadinejad supporters share the same goals in terms of more democracy in Iran as people who voted for Mousavi.
All right. I'm not sure what that fuzzing noise is, but if anyone's a master of the PA system, they can figure it out.
Help.
All right, so the next person that's going to speak today is Afshin Malavi, who's a fellow here at the New America Foundation. I read Afshin's book when I was a grad student. It was then in the hardcover called Persian Pilgrimages, and it was a brilliant blend of first-person reporting, travelogue, and contemporary history of Iran. The book is now called The Soul of Iran, and as of this morning, on Amazon's Movers and Shakers, it was number 2, and it had jumped 1,000 percentage points, which is where it belonged to begin with, but it finally is getting its due. So, Afshin, congratulations. This is a book, though, that honestly it is incredibly accessible, incredibly informative. There's nothing fluffy about it. Afshin uses his eyes and his window into Iran to take readers there, and I can't recommend it highly enough. So I'm going to ask Afshin to pick up sort of where Ken left off, sort of at the polling 3 weeks ago. Explain a little bit what happened between then and Election Day, and then feel free to take us up to the President as well.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Nicholas. And I remember those days when you were a grad student and you were looking to get into Iran, and I think it was all of Iran's loss that you didn't make it into Iran and you went to Pakistan instead because, while we're in the business of recommending books, you really did write a brilliant book on Pakistan. Let me do something, even before I get into your question, that we don't often do at think tanks. Let me just talk about human beings for a second. On June 20th, 2009, a woman named Neda Soltani was walking with her professor of philosophy on the streets of Tehran, observing the demonstrations. She was talking on a cell phone when a bullet pierced her heart, and she ended up dying within minutes. The video of Neda Soltani's death, as you know, went viral, and Neda Soltani became the most visible and iconic symbol, the first real martyr of this 2009 uprising. I know Neda Soltani. I don't know her personally, but I know her generation. When I was traveling across Iran to more than 20 cities and villages, I met children of the revolution like Neda Soltani, who was born in 1982. I echo, what Ken said. There's an enormous amount of disenchantment, a disillusion with the order of things in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Many of that generation refer to themselves as Nasl Sukhte, which in Persian means the burnt generation. When you look, one of the real tragedies of Iran is this is a place of enormous potential. This is a place that is highly literate. This is a place where women do very well at university. But this is also a place where there's an enormously high rate of brain drain, of young people seeking to leave the country. The other, I think, important point to note before I get into Nicholas's question is that Neda is not alone. There are Iranians out on the streets today. There are Nedas throughout Iranian history. This didn't start 1 week ago. This journey for freedom, for justice, began more than 100 years ago. In fact, this month we are in the centennial of the most important showdown of Iran's constitutional revolution of 1906 to 1911, which was yet again another attempt by a group of Iranians who were seeking liberty against obscurantist clerics, autocratic kings. This is part of the political soul of Iranians, and this is not new. One of the myths that we hear reported over and over again in the media, we hear the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The 1979 revolution was an uprising against an autocratic king. It was an uprising against the Shah. There were Islamists who played a role in it, but there were also nationalist Democrats. There were also communists, Islamic Marxists. There were a whole range of different groups. In the post-revolution, the Islamists won the post-revolution power struggle. They won partly the Khomeiniist Islamists, because it's also important to remember, again, that Ayatollah Khomeini, when he came forward with his idea of the Islamic Republic, he couldn't even get the grand Ayatollahs on his side. It was an aberration in the history of Shia clerical thought to say that the clerics should rule the state. So what he did get was Hojatul Islam's mid-ranking clerics to back him. It was, in a sense, a revolt of the colonels against the generals. Now, let us go to Ken's polling and what happened on election day. Iranian elections are short, mercifully short, some might say, for those of us who watch American elections. They generally take place over a 1-month period. Campaigning is limited to that period. And I think Ken's poll reflected a view, a snapshot, I think it was 3 to 4 weeks before the election. Is that right? I think Mousavi's campaign really caught fire in 2 to 3 weeks before election day. And I know Ken goes to great pains when he does his polls, and I know all pollsters, have some trouble when they're polling Iranians by telephone. It's not easy for Iranians to trust, the particular pollster. It's okay to say you believe in free speech. It's okay to say you believe in democracy, because those are things that the supreme leader says he believes in. It doesn't work in practice, but he does say he believes in them. But to say who your preferred political candidate is a much more difficult thing to do. But we'll take the numbers as they are. But it seems that Mousavi's campaign really caught fire. One of the great tragedies of this election and the outcome of this election is this was the most, within the limited parameters of the Islamic Republic elections with the Guardians Council that vets candidates for office, this was the most open and lively and vibrant elections we've seen. The televised debates were extraordinary. Ahmadinejad, I thought, in fact, performed fairly well in the televised debates. He was really pounding his opponents, particularly Mousavi as an associate of Rafsanjani, who's steeped in corruption. Now, what happened election day? The vote count, it seemed to there were striking irregularities. How do you count 40 million ballots in a matter of 1 hour? I've been in Iran in previous elections. Usually results are announced overnight. Why do you surround the Mousavi campaign headquarters with police and security services? Why were Mousavi websites blocked? Why, the day after the election were 200 of Mousavi's supporters, senior figures of the Islamic Republic, jailed? There are so many irregularities. There were so many irregularities that it is difficult for us to simply say, well, okay, Ahmadinejad won this election. It's difficult to endorse. I would also suggest you take a look on the website of Chatham House. They have a report out just recently in which they point out some of the striking irregularities of this election. But I don't think we need to get too deeply into that right now. I think what we need to look at is what has happened post-election, and particularly the figure of Mir Hussein Mousavi. Mir Hussein Mousavi, in many ways, is an accidental revolutionary. I don't even think he is a revolutionary, so let me take that back. He's an accidental opposition leader. But I think it is important to note that pre-election Mousavi is an entirely different person than post-election Mousavi. Post-election Mousavi is being driven by the crowds in many ways, as much as he is driving the crowds. And it will be, if we're going to look and see how this is all going to play out, we need to look at what Mousavi will do. We need to look at what Rafsanjani will do. Essentially, my analysis is what we're witnessing is an old guard revolutionary elite doing battle with a new guard revolutionary elite. The old guard. Yeah.
Let's come back to that in detail during the question and answer, if you don't mind.
And then I'll just close with the thought that the things to look out for going forward are: do we see more strikes? Do we see worker strikes? Do we see oil worker strikes? To put this into perspective, the revolution of 1979. The serious street protests began in late 1977. So this took a year. And the other thing is you had a whole range of organized opposition groups at that time, from the Mujahideen Khalq, the Fedayin Khalq, the Communist Tudeh Party, and a whole range of... And you had this extraordinary, charismatic, exiled political leader with unbending will named Ayatollah Khomeini. You don't see a lot of those elements right now yet.
Thanks, Afshin. So the next to speak is going to be Flint Leverett, who's the Director of Geopolitics and Energy Initiative and at the New America Foundation, and a former Senior Director of the Middle East Affairs, the National Security Council in 2002-2003. Flint, last Monday, you co-authored a piece in Politico, headlined, and we know now that writers don't always headline their own stories, but headlined, Ahmadinejad won, get over it.
That was actually our title.
Okay. So in that article, and kind of this comes back to something Afshin was mentioning, but in that article you said that, like most of the Western media, most American Iran experts overstated Mousavi's surge over the campaign's final weeks.
Yes.
I wanted to see if A, you still stood by that, B, if you could talk a little bit more about Mousavi 2 weeks ago versus Mousavi of today, and then feel free to fill in.
Yes, I do still stand by the points that we laid out in that article. I want to pick up on some of the subsequent analyses that have come out, sort of renewed attempts to show that there must have been fraud in the elections, and I particularly want to speak to the Chatham House study that Afshin referred to, because I think that study suffers from a fundamental and fatal methodological flaw. But let me address your bigger question about where Mousavi is now. I think that for all intents and purposes, the drama that we have seen in Iran over the 10 days since the election was held is effectively over. A week ago, I said that these protests would end, or would effectively end, when one of two things happened. when either the Guardian Council completed its review of the election results and, as I would anticipate, recertified Ahmadinejad as the elected president of Iran. Now, the Guardian Council is still going through its investigation. But the other thing that could have occurred and did occur was the Supreme Leader speaking. And from the moment that he spoke, it changed the nature of the protests, it changed the nature of the demonstrations from protests over what I think were genuinely perceived to be election irregularities. It changed from being that to being a challenge to the Islamic Republic itself, to the system as a whole. And I think once that threshold was crossed, the constituency within Iran for breaking down the system as a whole is very, very limited. Even among those Iranians, and I think there were people in those protests who genuinely want to believe they were working to take the Islamic Republic in a more pluralist, more open direction, had supported Mousavi's campaign with that ambition or aspiration in mind, that even the majority of those people do not want to challenge the system as a whole. They do not want to see the system implode. And so basically what we have seen over the weekend is that the demonstrations are dwindling away. This episode is over in any real strategic sense. What we are left with is an extraordinary amount of breathless commentary in Western media, motivated more by wishful thinking than by real analysis of on-the-ground political realities in Iran. And we still have a discussion in Washington, in the American body politic, that is focused on, well, gee, how long can this system last? It must surely be on the verge of collapse. And two, how can we possibly engage this system? You know, even Senator Lugar, who's been relatively sensible on this subject, is saying on television yesterday, we don't know who's going to be in charge in Tehran in 2 weeks. Yes, we do. We do. This system is not on the verge of collapse. The institutions of the Islamic Republic have responded to the controversy generated by the election results in a manner that is perfectly consistent with the Islamic Republic's constitutional order. They have done so with far less bloodshed than was experienced when the Chinese government suppressed the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. This is not a system that is on the verge of collapse. I do not believe that the Supreme Leader's standing or prestige has been damaged. When the controversy broke out, every faction involved in this dispute looked to the Supreme Leader as the only figure who with legitimacy could oversee the arbitration of this controversy. This is not a system that is about to fall apart. I think that Mousavi is now having to find a way to walk back from the challenge that he presented over the last week. I think he's trying to find a way to walk back with dignity. I do not believe he is going to go to the mat on this, either with or without the support of Rafsanjani. He is not going to challenge the system as a whole. In a strategic sense, this episode is over. Ahmadinejad will remain the elected president of Iran. And if the United States wants to engage the Islamic Republic of Iran, it is going to be engaging an Islamic Republic of Iran in which Ayatollah Khamenei remains the supreme leader and Ahmadinejad, as I said, is the president. Now, I think it is eminently in the interests of the United States to engage that Islamic Republic of Iran. There is a massively important strategic agenda between the United States and Iran that needs to be worked through in a serious and comprehensive way. That is the ball that American policymakers need to keep their eye on. In the same way that the Bush 41 administration kept its eye on the ball after Tiananmen Square and preserved the basic strategic framework of the U.S.-China relationship, which had been built up so painstakingly after Nixon's historic trip to Beijing in 1972. Okay. That was the right thing for the Bush administration to do. It would be the right thing for the Obama administration to pursue strategically grounded engagement with Iran. We'll see if the Obama administration is up to doing the right thing in this case.
All right, so we'll come back to rapprochement with Iran in a bit, and also I'll be taking bets on the Flint-Afshin wrestling match after the game.
And I will come back to the Chatham House study because I think it's fundamentally flawed.
Okay, so Nader Muzaffizadeh, thank you very much for joining us today. Nader is a consulting fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and also the author of an op-ed in the Washington Post last week called "Option Ignore Ahmadinejad." So, Nader, what I wanted to ask you is, I wanted to see if you thought something has changed in the power equation over the past few weeks, or if we, as American punditry, American population, is just becoming aware of the power equation in Iran, and kind of where this now. What does this mean, all in terms of Obama's policy of engagement moving forward?
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me first also pay tribute to Afshin and Flint and others on the panel for the tremendous work that's done. I think I should say that I regret seeing Afshin's tie, that my UN persona prevented me from doing the same today. So I'll blame that on the UN, if I may. I spent 8 years there. And I'll come to this, but while Flint's, I think, rather cool burial of the movement is perhaps, and I think likely accurate in terms of what outcome we're going to see over the next week, I think it should be clear, and I'll come back to this, that it does result in an outcome, 4 more years of Ahmadinejad, that is not only inimical to what we, I think, can fairly say is the broader wish of the next generation of Iranians. It is also inimical to our interests, and I think not unimportantly to our values. And I'll come back to why I think the Tiananmen analogy actually is not entirely accurate. But I'll limit my remarks to 3 points, and also to your question, Nicholas. What hasn't changed and what has changed since the election, why what I call an adversarial engagement, because that's what this is going to be, should nevertheless go forward, but should end rather than begin with the nuclear question, and we can come back to that as well. But why also the President, in my view, said too little, too late, or how I also think of this is the option of why things can be true even if they're said by Charles Krauthammer and Paul Wolfowitz. I think it's, in terms of what hasn't changed, as along the lines of what Flint says, is that in Iran, which will be a strategic challenge to the United States for a very long time going forward, in Iran that in many areas has differing interests, has alliances across the world that are inimical to our interests, but also in a number of areas, beginning with Pakistan, but certainly in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere in the Gulf, has interests that coincide more than we think. I think if you talk to anyone who went to Iran over the last year and met with the senior leadership, including Khomeini, and on down, when asked what their strategic concern was, the number one thing they mentioned was Pakistan. And as we know, that is or ought to be a bigger concern of ours. That is just one example. What also hasn't changed is the Iranian nuclear program. We may talk a little bit more about this, but it's clear to everyone that Mousavi had no intention, I think, of compromising any more meaningfully on that than the consensus of the regime. And that is, I think, a nuclear program that, whatever we may think of it, not in any way that is acceptable in cost to the West, can either be bombed back to zero or negotiated back to zero. And finally, what hasn't changed is a strong national sentiment. I mean, I think if you have seen, and Afshin knows this much better than I think most of us up here, is that going through and across the movement in Iran and all the way through Ahmadinejad's supporters, of course, is a very strong nationalist element in Iran. It was a big part of the revolution, of course, in '79, but I think also is what will support a continuing tough line on the nuclear question, but also I think can be used to our advantage if we are a little more clever in our diplomacy. What has changed? I think, despite maybe, and I'll disagree with Flint a little bit, is that the Iranian people, I think, have posed an unprecedented challenge to the regime's legitimacy, something that we haven't seen in 30 years. And what I refer to more than the dispute between Mousavi and Ahmadinejad, where I think, certainly I think from everything I've read, it's frankly unknowable, the degree of fraud, the degree of real support for Ahmadinejad, etc. I think what we can be certain of is that things did not go according to plan. And what that means is that means and steps were taken by the regime, which in other democracies or places where the voting and the counting counts as much as the voting would not have happened. But I think the Iranian people are showing that there's a second election going on, and that's an election which has been prompted by the fraudulent outcome of the first, which is what kind of future are they going to have in terms of their own freedoms. So that, I think, is a real change. I also think that the cracks at the top are meaningful. While I think it's true that everyone was looking to Khomeini to rule, on Friday, the fact that Mousavi went right back the next day and didn't accept that ruling, the fact that Rafsanjani, by all accounts, is still opposing a lot of what Khomeini is doing, I think is a very meaningful breach. And Larijani is playing both sides of the game, but I think still that is a meaningful breach which is new from the election. And finally, and I think this is important to the policy response, the outside world's view of Iran has changed. I think so much of what we've seen in terms of inaccurate analysis and reporting, also, frankly, from Iran, has been given the lie by the images of the last week. And I think that makes it much harder to provide any simplistic account of where the Iranian people is and what they want for the future. So what are the policy implications? I think assuming what I would call a slow strangulation, though unfortunately I think quite effective by the regime, I think the president is faced with a poisoned set of choices. So either he shuns the regime, takes a harder line, and is led down to a path of conflict, or he goes forward as if more or less the last week had not happened. And I think implicitly gives legitimacy to a violent usurper, which I think would be a mistake as well. An alternative that I've proposed, difficult and in some ways incoherent as it is that the president and the administration look at what has happened, understand that things have changed, and do two things. One is, in a much greater degree than it has, acknowledge the fact that there is a movement, not Mousavi versus Ahmadinejad, but a movement for greater freedoms, but at the same time, as Flint said, keep their eye on the ball in terms of what is needed in terms of strategic negotiations. And there, I mean, I can come back to this, but I think you start with all the areas where we can work together, Pakistan, etc. You end with the nuclear question, and you end, at the end of the day, focusing on intentions rather than capabilities, over which I think we have little control. Finally, on the president's reaction, and again, I made a little joke about this because I think looking from London, where I live, this became very quickly a very parochial sort of intramural debate in Washington between neocons and liberals, and the fact that some people on the other side came out and criticized the president made others say, well, of course he had to be right because these people clearly have no legitimacy and no credibility given what they were involved in the last 8 years. And so I think there is more he could have done. Certainly, Thursday when I did my piece in the Post, more was said on Saturday. But I would just, this is as much for the panel, but I was struck by this phrase, bearing witness, which the statement on Saturday ended with. There's a fantastic human rights organization called Human Rights Watch, whose motto is, tyranny has a witness. And when I read this, I thought, I'm not sure that it's the role of the United States government to bear witness. It is also to bear witness, but it is to do more. I think we bore a splendid witness to Rwanda and a number of other crises in the world. And so that's an approach that worries me. More generally, it seems to me that in the kind of affairs of state and diplomacy, lessons are most often learned either too late or too much. The example of Rwanda for the UN is important because the Somalia effect, that is the sense after Somalia, the Somalia debacle, that the UN, the United States, would not provide troops was a huge part of the thinking around why more troops could not be sent to Rwanda. They paid a price for Somalia. My worry is that here there's an overlearning of the lessons of history of 53 and 79, and there's an overlearning of the lessons of the Bush years. One that fundamentally, I think, misreads the ability of the Iranian people to make a distinction between this president and George W. Bush, support for what is a movement for democratic rights, as opposed to support for the reinstallment of a Shah against a nationalist democratic regime. And there's the overreading of the Bush years. I think clearly there were excesses, and we can all agree on those, but that doesn't mean that they should tie the hands and necessarily inhibit this president, particularly this president, given what he did in Cairo and what he's been able to do elsewhere, to come out stronger than he has. This is a unique moment for Iran, which, alas, I think is slipping through our hands, and I think this is a unique president who can address it differently, and so why the conventional response would be my question.
Thanks, Nader. Last but certainly not least, Steve Clements certainly doesn't need an introduction, but for those of you who don't know, Steve is the director of the American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation. He also writes a very influential blog called The Washington Note, which has, along with a couple of other blogs over the past week, really filled a gap that the mainstream media has not been able to fill as a result of all their visas expiring and all of them being kicked out. So what I wanted to ask Steve, if you could talk a little bit about Twitter, and talk a little bit, though, about, I know, but talk about the information wars that are happening through this new media. And also you wrote a post yesterday talking about radicalization and nationalism. And what do you think the regime, should it survive, will look like?
Well, thank you. Very different direction than I was planning to go. I think this is an interesting panel, and I pay tribute to all my colleagues. And Nader was great here. Flint Leverett, who's been very brave, Afshin as well, in discussing these matters. I think the only thing we would all agree on is the quality of Nick Schmidl's book. And this is complicated to do, but let me address quickly what Nick put on the table, because I did write a bit yesterday about Twitter fraud and Twitter wars, and raising some questions and doubts about this Twitter mania that is going on. While I have found it extremely valuable in reaching some, there was a young gentleman named Scott Owens, I think that's Simon Owens, who found that someone who is actually sending out something authentic, a sort of underlying Twitter, is being retweeted 57 times on average, some up to 300 times. And so there's this massive outpouring of stuff. And what I found, being one of perhaps the breathless commentators that Flint may have obliquely referred to, was there was information that was coming out that often, looked very certain. One of the things that surprised me, and I have to say that I suspended my own logic for a moment, was the thing that after the shooting had begun, after people had been killed, there was this notion about embassies taking in injured people, which to me on one hand I said, wow, they're going to put themselves right in a train wreck with whomever consolidates power if the regime doesn't fall, and this would be a remarkable thing. But hell, who am I? If they're doing that, then who am I to judge? Well, it turns out that turned to be a mostly fraudulent statement. There may be cases in which some embassies were taking an injured, but at least in the British embassy case, in which I added, along with a very detailed map that others had sent, an Iranian diplomat friend of mine that was serving in China was the one who actually sent it to me. I didn't get it from Twitter, but it was. I think he got it from Twitter, to tell you the truth. But, it could have been a case where the British came back, called the ambassador, and they certainly weren't doing it, though there was a lot of folks in the British Foreign service who would have loved to have been on what they consider the side of the angels on that, but it would have subjected them to all sorts of claims. And then you have Twitter feeds that are clearly either sick people or they're people that were aligned with Khamenei and Ahmadinejad that were saying Musavi's been arrested, hooligans have done all this. I mean, an obvious, sophisticated misinformation campaign and an engine of capacity there that was surprising for a state that felt comfortable about having won the election legitimately. But let me hit some other quick moments. I'm one of those who look. There's a dispute and a battle going on that's unusual between realists. I completely agree with Hilary Mann and Flint Leverett about the broader strategic imperatives of engaging Iran at a certain point. And I think you're with us on that too, though you would dispute the question of as somewhat of a so-called progressive realist. I want to ask Flint where his progressive part in this, but I realize he's a more hardcore uber realist in this. I don't agree with Flint and Hillary that at the moment they came out so dismissively against those people who'd said for them this election was not over. It's not our place as observers or Americans or the White House or others to dictate to the body politic within Iran at what point its election is over and what it is. And it kind of reminds me of a guy on staff here, I'm sure he's in the audience, John Wallace, who's obsessed with sports polls. I don't know what you call them. These betting things, You get big trees. I know nothing about sports. I never participate. But what I think Flint has done is there is a process underway where he sort of picked the winner and said, well, I'm going to put my money there, and disregarding all the rest. I wish I could do that with John Wallace's sports polls because I'm disinterested. But I think when you're realistic about what's happened, where literally millions of people, not just in Tehran, but throughout the country are out on the streets all night, there's something historic and unprecedented happening, which my colleague Flint seems not to want to recognize or acknowledge in any way. And in my view, the Iranian people are saying our election is not over. Our process, he may be betting, and he has a lot of reasons to do so, that in fact he has a pretty good understanding where things will come out. I'm not quite as sure, particularly when you just restrict yourself to the statements of elites around Khamenei, around Ahmadinejad, around the Guardian Council. You can find enough conflict, enough diversity of view, regardless of what's happening out on the streets, to say there's something much more dramatic going on that we haven't seen for a long time. I'm not disputing that things may come out where Flint says, but I think it is disrespectful of process and disrespectful with. And Ali Larijani, I find interesting on how he's playing all sides of this. If he were as definitive as Flint, perhaps I would feel differently. But Ali Larijani will be on the winning side no matter what, and he hasn't picked what side. I think he only wishes he could have Flint Leverett's certainty. Karim Sajadpour, when we did our election discussion about the poll with Flint Leverett and Ken Ballin and my colleague Patrick Doherty and others before, I quoted Karim Sajadpour, who said that the election would be unfree, unfair, and unpredictable. And I think that what we saw in an unfair and unfree election in which the candidates were handpicked, lots of people who would have otherwise run did not run, were not run. This is not a democracy in the sort of terms we have. That you've seen, somewhat of a civil war break out among elites in that situation. And in my view, that needs to play out. And I think it's dangerous for any country, particularly, gives me another reason to dislike Benjamin Netanyahu, for the Israeli government to inject himself, notwithstanding the United States in this, and to not pay respect to what's happened. One of the things that I think is interesting that Afshin and others have referred to is that this term "death to America" has been replaced by "death to the dictator" throughout the country. I've talked to a good half dozen senior people, former ambassadors, senior policy intellectuals in Tehran who were as defending of the state and of Ahmadinejad until all this played out. They now are fear for their arrest. These are people who defended that state who now say it's not the same, that the rules have changed, and I think that those people, to some degree, deserve some respect. And wait till, even in the United States, we don't have Al Franken versus Norm Coleman results. I mean, it's ironic that we would be trying to impose some sort of a calendar on what the Iranians are doing. I also think with the question of competing nationalisms that it is a mistake many on the left are making in the United States, that this is all about our style of democracy and freedom and not. It is, this is where Flint is right. This is a palace coup or palace civil war among people who largely believe in the term in terms of the thing. But underlying that, as Ken Ballin's excellent, I thought, fascinating poll showed, there's an appetite and a hunger for different things among the people. Whether the government actually yields to that or not down the road is an entirely different thing. But another dimension of this debate, which hasn't been discussed, and I'm trying to think it through now, is what does this struggle within Iran do for other hotspots? What does it do for the message about Hezbollah, Hamas, offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood, who are trying to seduce? I mean, the standard line among various groups that are trying to sort of appeal for legitimacy in the eyes of various publics because of grievances is Iran has been a primary driver of that, in part because of its own grievances with the United States, the Mossadegh, the Shah, and whatnot, and to some degree the narrative inside Iran has changed, where in the social contract that Iranian citizens thought they had in the government, they know that it's not a full democracy, that the theocrats, the mullahs have lots of leverage, but there's a point at which they have a choice too. And to some degree, well, the reason why death to the dictator has come up so much is in part they feel like their country has been, that their own state has essentially robbed them of something they thought was part of their social deal. And I think we ought not to get in the way of that. Let it play out. Someone will consolidate power. It may be the same thugs that we're dealing with now, but the United States has a rich history of dealing with thugs, and this is where I rejoin the realists. I don't have a problem at that level. You have to deal with the world as it is, and you have to try to reach certain strategic objectives. But I think it's very, very misguided to some degree to not allow these social movements and change to come forward. And I would just say, you know, there's a debate among Iran experts. I'm very respectful of Barbara Slavin, who's been on our side in a lot of things. She wrote me on Facebook the other day. She said, you know, Iran, the Islamic Republic, stopped being a Islamic Republic a week ago, and now is a military dictatorship. And I do think that this discussion we're having among realists and among progressive realists is very, very important, because if you can't see the possibilities of change elsewhere, and those things do happen. I mean, Flint's put himself way out. Everything may run according to the script he just said. You can go onto one of those stock things and bet on maybe Flint's view. But if it doesn't, then it does show that to some degree our own calipers for judging what might happen in terms of transformation elsewhere, and also the impact on related movements in other parts of the Middle East, I think represent real problems. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
All right, so I know that everyone is probably clamoring to ask a question. Since this is my first panel, I'm going to take my prerogative as being the moderator and ask a couple of very quick questions. I would ask the answers to be kept to like literally a minute, and so then we can open it up to the floor. I wanted to ask Ken, before we get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on in Iran, how the results of this poll and the aftermath has influenced the way that you now would consider how you would go about polling in Iran or in places like Iran in the future.
I'll use the microphone this time. Or maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. I think, it's a very difficult environment to conduct accurate polling in. And actually Pakistan, which you're familiar with, is actually easier because there's more of a tradition in Pakistan of being able to speak out. I think that, if we had unlimited resources, we would do multiple polls before an election so that we can get one further out and one closer. I think that would have been helpful in this case.
Does the lack of political parties necessarily in Iran, the fact that it's personality-based, the fact that someone can grab momentum at the last minute and run with it, does that complicate? I mean, how significantly does that complicate polling?
I don't think that necessarily would if you had the series of polls being able to measure it, would necessarily complicate it. It's to pick up on something Afshin said, it's very striking, and this is not in the headlines of the poll, how open-minded the Iranians are in some respects. I mean, it's the only country in the region where we've polled where people have a favorable opinion of Jews. While they're against Israel, they make that distinction. And I think that's a fairly sophisticated... That's why I think you can have a population, even a large group of whom may vote for Ahmadinejad, who want more democratic freedoms. So there's a lot of subtleties they make that I dare say we haven't seen in many countries, including this one.
Well, I've got a list of about 10 questions for Afshin, so I'll give you a choice.
All right.
Could you talk about either the mourning cycles and how this now could perpetuate the protest? Could you talk about the Basij, Ansar Hezbollah, or the palace intrigues and the personalities? Whichever you take, whatever one.
Sure. Well, let me just start maybe with the Basij and the Ansar Hezbollah, which is a group of sort of the hardest of the hardline thugs. Flint did mention, something about, Iran experts missing the on-the-ground realities. I'd argue that actually those people who speak almost solely to Iranian diplomats have miss the on-the-ground realities, because when you are on the ground, you actually do see some of the malignancies of this regime. I've been in protests in '99 and 2003. I've seen the thugs unleashed, on the population. But when you talk to Javad Zarif, Iran's ambassador to the UN, or other people like that, you see the pragmatic, urbane, side of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I think that it's important to remember that. But I've always been on, Flint's side and on Steve's side on the importance of engaging the Islamic Republic of Iran. As a broad diplomatic principle, I believe in engagement. When you isolate countries, you get Cuba and North Korea. But I'm also with Steve in this regard, in that we don't need to necessarily lay down that policy right now and be so definitive about it. The other thing is that, when I think it was de Gaulle, when he was meeting with an American president, I can't remember which one, the American president was trying to convince him of something. And de Gaulle said, hold on a second, if the American president is telling me this, I don't need proof. I'm not so sure Ahmadinejad and Khamenei live up to that test. And when you win an election by a 2-to-1 margin, and you unleash this amount of firepower on the streets against people who are protesting peacefully, why not just open the election results? And so the Revolutionary Guard Basij forces, they have the upper hand here. Khamenei does have the upper hand here. This is where I agree with Flint. We're not on the verge of Khamenei leaving anytime soon. But I would say that this is, no matter what happens, Ayatollah Khamenei has been diminished. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has been diminished.
All right, Flint. Last week, after your piece and after Ken's piece, and Ken wrote his piece with Patrick Doherty, who's here at New America, I think that for a few days until Steve cleared the air up, we had a reputation in New America as being closet Ahmadinejad lovers. And I was wondering if you, I don't know if you all have noticed yet, but Flint is a realist in the purest sense. I don't, and I wonder whether you...
He's the crack cocaine realist.
I wonder whether there's a part of you that actually, in the Obama administration breaking from the Bush administration's ideological foreign policy, and you wanting this Nixon go to China moment, you wanting this rapprochement as an illustration of that, did secretly or not so secretly harbor an Ahmadinejad win because he was the only person who could deliver on the rapprochement?
I really don't think so. My prediction before the election, for people who asked me, I said, if you absolutely forced me to bet money, I would bet money on an Ahmadinejad re-election, but hopefully I wouldn't have to bet a lot of money on it. And I think, in retrospect, after the results came out, I think that there was a really extraordinary rush to judgment that the results had to have been fraudulent. I did want to say on the Chatham House study that's come out since Hillary and I published the Politico piece, all of the analysis that Ansari and his colleagues lay out is based on a comparison of the first round of the 2005 election with this year's election, which I think is a really misleading comparison. In the first round of 2005, Ahmadinejad was as plausible a candidate as Karoubi or any of the others. The real comparison is with the second round in 2005 when Ahmadinejad trounced Rafsanjani with essentially the same percentage of the vote that he won this time. Despite the presence of Karoubi and Rezai on the ballot this time, this was always a two-man race from the outset. And so if you want to compare results, you should compare the second round of 2005 with this, and then I think a lot of these alleged or perceived discrepancies or hard to explain things in the data basically disappear. In terms of I try to look at this as a realist, not just in terms of my policy preferences, but also in terms of my work as an analyst. What do I think is actually happening in Iran? What do I think is playing out? And here is to address Steve's point. I am not in the business of telling foreign populations what it is in their interest to do. I'm in the business of trying to address American audiences about what is happening and what it means for American foreign policy. When I wrote Ahmadinejad 1, Get Over It, I was addressing an American audience, first of all with an analytic judgment, and second of all with a set of policy recommendations. If the Iranian people want to prove me wrong as an analyst, it is, that is their prerogative to do so. It is. I mean, I'm told that I get read a bit in Tehran, but I have no illusions that I'm affecting things on the ground in Iran. What I'm out to affect is attitudes here, and what I saw happen over the last week was an extraordinary amount of wishful thinking, a rush to judgment. There had to have been fraud. This regime has to be on the verge of collapse, and this regime has proven itself too depraved in order for the U.S. to be able to engage it. That to me is just reminiscent of the kind of rush to judgment and acceptance of myths about Saddam's WMD, Saddam's ties to al-Qaeda, that led to what I think is a really profoundly bad decision to go to war.
Let me ask Nader something about the dynamic of who's in the streets right now. I mean, we have protesters that are armed with rocks and pieces of concrete against the Basij and the Revolutionary Guard. It's kind of an unfair fight. I read something today, though, that mentioned that the people who have the guns are actually the ethnic groups, the ethnic militant groups on the borders. How, when, if does that become a factor in this conflict?
I think not likely to become a factor at all. I mean, I think there are others who, for years, have dreamt up a scenario of inflicting a kind of separatist implosion of the Iranian state as a way of countering the influence of Iran. I think it's highly unlikely to happen. The people with guns in the street are the Basij in Tehran, and I think those are the ones we need to worry about. And I think, if I may turn back to a bit of the prior discussion on this, is that I think we all, particularly after the last 8 years, crave a certain and significant degree of realism in our foreign policy. But I think it is a somewhat limited realism that quite so quickly can dismiss what we've seen in the last 10 days in Iran. And I also think that if you listen to other senior clerics and their open criticism of the poll, the way it was announced, the way it was managed, something more is going on. And so I would, the counterfactual that is interesting to me is, let's say none of this had happened. I think the way that Flint is proposing that we proceed is as if nothing of the last 10 days had really happened. And I think that is a kind of realism that will blind itself to a movement and a yearning among Iranian people, which will influence eventually what happens in the country, which in the end, of course, should influence our policy towards Iran. And then I would say about the Tiananmen analogy, if I may, Tiananmen happened halfway through Deng Xiaoping's, till now, policy of openness and capitalist reforms. This is happening, and the metaphorical toast, and I don't want to make this too tough on Flint, but the metaphorical toast that we would now deliver to Ahmadinejad happens at a time where certainly a contested election, I think we can agree on that, will put into power a man who broadly stands for a less open, more reactionary, less free Iran, less responsive, I think, fairly to be said, to its people, and certainly much less likely to be willing to engage us. I mean, I broadly agree, and I've written about this, about the importance of engagement as a policy and how we should go about it and how the nuclear question should not blind us to the other areas where we can agree. But I think we should assume that this man is much less likely to also engage with us and be willing to step up on the other side, even if we stretch out our hand.
All right, last question for Steve, and then we'll open up to the audience. Steve, my question is palace intrigue, both in the White House and in Qom. Pick one and talk about it. Sort of talk a little bit about how what's happening in the streets of Tehran is affecting divisions within the political elite in Iran and within the political elite in Washington.
I have to be careful here. I think what's happening among political elites in Iran is clear, is that Rafsanjani and Mousavi and Karoubi and their fellow travelers are engaged in, they may be accidental, or this could have been a purpose. It could be Rafsanjani flexing his muscles, saying, "I'm really, disgusted with this." You have Ali Larijani, who's been, on an opposite side of Ahmadinejad, but supportive of Khamenei. I mean, you do have all of the dimensions of sort of a old Politburo style crisis, among people in different factions, and so how that comes out, I think, is going to be interesting. It may come out very much like Flint says, but I have to say that Flint's certainty about what Mousavi will do is if we had been here having this talk over the weekend, you might not have predicted Mousavi would have made some of the statements he made. I mean, it's hard to sort of, you might be right, but but your analysis would have started that Mousavi would not have called, for this statement, would not have called for a direct collision with what Khamenei had said after his Friday prayers. So there is a very clear split, and what I find interesting, fascinating, and maybe a bit ghoulish is that people that I know on the inside say that Iran's system of being able to deal with these kinds of battles among the elites, everyone's crossed all the red lines. And it's very hard for people to figure out what kind of behaviors gets everybody back in under the same roof. Or, alternatively, do Khamenei and Ahmadinejad fear for their lives every night the rest of the time that they're out there, because they clearly know they've got enormous enemies riddled throughout the system, even at the highest levels. So that's a problem. What's interesting about the White House, just very quickly, is there's no doubt that Obama had both, I think, an instinct to basically remain out and step aside and not to comment, not to to let it go out, but I think people know that Vice President Biden was along the lines, of wanting to sort of see the United States come out and, say something that made more common cause with the people in the street. And that you couldn't be America and not make those kind of comments. And I think in Obama's statement over the weekend, that he got a perfect, in my view, a perfect blend of those, which is one, he's been saying we need to have strategic objectives. I think it was a mistake. Flint probably liked what he said. Mistake to say that Mousavi and Ahmadinejad were the same as far as we were concerned, because it again disrespected what was going on the street. I think Obama shouldn't have said anything at all, frankly, or he should have said, there's a process underway, let's see where that goes. If he wanted to talk about the broader strategic importance of engagement down the road, that's fine too. Probably disagree in the sense that I don't think it's our role in that sense. We dealt with Mao, we've dealt with Brezhnev, we've dealt with a lot of other players in the world, and we ought not to walk away from the fact that you have to deal with other troubling governments. My problem is that we don't know how that process is going to come in, and so there is a bit of a division, and it's the old line division between those who tilt realist and those who tilt liberal interventionists, and how they go. And I'm one that thinks that Obama has played it right so far with one misstep, but there are people who see it differently in his camp.
All right, so we'll see if anyone else sees it differently. When we give you the mic, we're going to ask for identify yourself, your affiliation, and no comments, please, just questions. One question, sorry, and then we'll keep the answer short and keep this engagement going. Go ahead, right here.
Hi, my name is Keith Weissman. I want to just congratulate all the panelists for essentially adopting part of the Hippocratic Oath, is when you don't know what's going on, do no harm. And the quick question I have, if I can go back to old Persian political theory, is, has the Islamic Republic lost its fad?
That's a good question. Fad is kind of this legitimacy that is bestowed from above, from God in many ways, and the Persian kings had this fad. I think to some extent the Islamic Republic has been losing its fad for a long time, even before this crisis. You know, for us to say that the people out onto the streets want an Islamic republic, and they were simply voting for a reformer, you know, that's all that they were given a choice for. They've never been given a choice. So the question is, we really don't know, Keith. You know, they've never been given a choice of a secular nationalist in the Mossadegh tradition to vote for. They've never been given the choice of a real liberal to vote for. So we really don't know. I think this is the most significant crisis of legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. And let me go back to the debates. One of the reasons that I think this is the most significant crisis of legitimacy is not even the election itself, but what Ahmadinejad did in the debates. Ahmadinejad tore apart pillars of the Islamic Republic, lions of the revolution like Rafsanjani and Mousavi and Natek Nouri and Karoubi. And he basically said, you guys are just a bunch of fat cat insiders doing dirty deals. Now, members of the Iranian modern middle classes and secular middle classes might have already felt that way. But Ahmadinejad supporters didn't. And so what he did is, in a sense, he questioned them. And so as Steve said, all sorts of red lines have been crossed since the election, but a lot of red lines were crossed before the election as well.
Kati?
Kati Martin, New America Foundation Board. Picking up on this gentleman's well-made point that first do no harm should be the premise of this and any other panel. I wonder, I take your point, Mr. Leverett, that you're a policy advisor, and indeed you were in your prior incarnation, but at the moment you are a part of the global media, and when you dismiss a revolution by saying basically that it's over, get over it, I wonder if you consider it as you must know that your advice is no longer limited to a room in the White House or in the NSC, that it is indeed all over the internet, whether you considered what the impact of such airy dismissal of people who are willing to risk their lives for something they believe in. Did you consider the impact that headline might have on them? And you proudly admitted that it was indeed your headline.
Flint?
Well, first of all, as I said, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I have any reason to believe that what I say or write from a comfortable perch in Washington has a lot of impact on the decision making of individual Iranian citizens who are looking at an election result and trying to figure out what it means and how they want to respond to it. I would just respectfully disagree with the premise of the question. I never saw this as an incipient revolution. I think that you spoke about my airy dismissal of this revolution, but I mean, to some degree, I think there was also a lot of kind of reflexive embrace of what we saw going on in the aftermath of the election as, oh, surely this must be a revolution. This must be some majoritarian movement that really represents the desire of the bulk of Iranian society to get rid of the Islamic Republic and move on to something that we in the West would like better. And I simply never saw any evidence to think that that was the case. And I still don't believe that even at its height, that the movement that was out in the streets protesting the election results, represented majoritarian sentiment in Iran.
Ben, I've got a guy right here with a plaid shirt to your left, 2 rows back, and then after that to the woman right in front.
Yes, I'm Judd Schilling with Millennium Institute, and this is very useful information added to the scattering of other things I've been able to read, but I'm still faced with a very fundamental question about what was really causing the people out on the streets to have such a protracted and intense opposition to the government. If the bulk of the Iranians wanted more democracy, and if the majority of them actually voted for Ahmadinejad, then what was driving the people there? Did they have some information we don't, that the election was not fairly done? That was what driving the people of Musave? Or are there people who voted for Ahmadinejad who are part of these demonstrators who feel that they're not getting the degree of democracy they want? But I want to know the makeup of these people and what it is that was driving them to go out and put on such intense demonstrations.
Great. Steve or Nader, either one of you all want to?
Well, I just say, from just talking to people, I think everything from Musavi's dramatic wife and the claim for the morals police to be shut down, to talking about education and rights for women was a major animator of a significant portion of the population. And I think that both Afshin and I, who were spending a lot of time on the phone talking with people, heard an alternative narrative about what the differences are between Ahmadinejad and Musavi as they saw it, was a sort of demand for sort of a not Obama-like, that never came up, but for sort of a humbler leadership, something that they felt that Ahmadinejad's stridency over issues of the Holocaust and whatever had increased the isolation of Iran and had not achieved strategic gains or strategic traction. In other words, it's kind of a weird thing to say that if Ahmadinejad had actually achieved something with that stridency, that's fine. But the whole question was there wasn't that. Plus, 20% inflation, a sense that there may be a bit of a class war thing going on. I don't know. But there were a lot of things that were animating, the opposition. What I found most interesting, Jed, was talking to people who were part of the elite structure of that system, whom I've been in conferences with in many, many occasions, who themselves weren't so swept up by the Green Revolution, but they've become definitive defectors now from the Khomeini-Ahmadinejad axis because they're so angry at the treatment of people. Their systems have been shut down. Their people that they know have been arrested. Their sense of dismay at a code of ethics that they believe in. I mean, this is not. I strongly disagree with those that think there is something. This is somehow, an underground democratic revolution that's coming in. It is something that I think is more defined by elites who themselves have become dismayed with what happened. And that's why I differ somewhat from how Flint's reading this. It is talking to people that are part of the inner circle who themselves aren't on the same page anymore.
So
the voting was miscounted and that more people voted for Musavi than was reported?
I don't share Flynn's confidence at all that Ahmadinejad would have won. Where I thought, but it's as uninformed as any other speculation, but looking at the poll results, looking at what other, experts were saying, I think that I was persuaded by Flynn that in the end, Ahmadinejad may win. In a second round run or something of that sort. I think there's some credibility to the notion that even with minor rigging in the end, Ahmadinejad might have won. But the issue that came in is that seeing this, sea of green, seeing the movement going on, and looking at the fear that when they looked at the fact that Ahmadinejad might not have been able to generate a majority in the combined votes that look like an increasingly protest vote with Kurabi and Musavi, that the government then took steps to do it. I think I do believe that that is a highly credible scenario. And I wish Flint would give it, a
So
greater
we've
look.
got about 10 minutes left and a lot of hands. So I'm going to ask the questions to be very brief one-liners, the responses to be brief two-liners, and then we'll start taking questions in groups. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. Ahu Azir from CNN Turk and Milliyet. Two very quick questions. Mr. Levert, don't you think your basic argument would underline what President Obama did in Cairo to encourage the youth in entire Middle East to engage in political discourse? Wouldn't it be killing the whole process of engagement in the entire area? The second one is, what makes you think that 2 months from now, this administration may be open for business, but Tehran may not be open for business?
Great question.
I don't know why we should expect that Tehran wouldn't be open for business. I don't expect the terms under which they would do business to change a whole lot. But, I think that there was, a cautious interest in seeing if Obama is really serious about wanting to put U.S.-Iranian relations on a different trajectory. I think that interest was there before this election. I think it is likely to be there after this election, so I don't really see why this should forestall that, unless we, on our side, basically get all wrapped up in hand-wringing about what might have happened or what fraud there might have been, and paralyze ourselves, and then basically leave the policy deliberations open to those who want to take Iran policy toward a regime change policy, just as Iraq policy was taken that way. And remember, it wasn't George W. Bush who defined the goal of American policy as regime change. It was President Bill Clinton in 1998 when he signed the Iraq Liberation Act. This is a bipartisan deficit here.
All right, so we're going to take 1, 2, 3 questions right here, and then we'll take them at the panel. Go ahead, sir.
One of the reasons Obama won, obviously, is because he indicated an openness to seeing the world as it is. At the same time, his campaign had a huge impact on people's notions about democracy, right? And the Cairo speech just continued that. So I would support what the lady said and ask, isn't that an important part of his consideration, if only for his credibility? And in fact, doesn't it open up opportunities if by inspiring people that we can, that these impacts play out like that? Isn't that something he'd want to take advantage of?
Following the comment about is Tehran going to be open, could you say what, presuming the dissent is suppressed, but the anger remains, what do you think Ahmadinejad and Khomeini's approach, do you see any change? Will it try to take into account what it's seen, or will it be more repressive?
I was curious about the how the reform movement, for lack of a better phrase, how the reformists are going to emerge from this incident, for lack of a better word. And I was wondering what, if any, role Mousavi will play in this.
Great. So I'm just going to ask, starting this way, if everyone wants to talk for, I see you all scribbling, 45 seconds or so, and then we'll do one more batch of questions before we're done. Steve?
Real quick, reformist Mousavi, we have no idea. We just don't know. We don't. I mean, Flint sees him walking back in trying to find a face-saving way to do so. I don't think this is over. So I think the question is, but I think that the notion that reform has popped up last week is mistaken. There's been a factionalized system struggles over this for quite a while. I think that struggle will continue. I'll leave the leadership in Iran question. Cairo speech, be careful with the Cairo speech. I'm writing a piece right now comparing the Cairo speech to Obama's September 2006 Kenya speech. And in this Kenya speech, in my view, you saw a more naive Obama that let loose something in Kenya. It was essentially an anti-incumbent, anti-corruption speech that as events unfolded, in Kenya, and I think that he had some effect on the behavior of the players there. Obama could not deliver on anything at all. The Cairo speech, I think, was extremely important because it affirmed the humanity of Muslims, and particularly Arab Muslims, put a human face on it. But it is not. It was not a speech calling for a sort of democratic revolution. And I think that there's a mistake in the way that's been dealt with. He gave it in Cairo. It was a blend. It was the progressive realist speech that was dealing with things as they are, but it was not calling for this. I think one of the interesting reason I thought Obama made such a mistake in his comment about Ahmadinejad and Mousavi before was that one of the powerful things about the Cairo speech in Obama is that he was speaking beyond command and control governments to citizens. And what he made a mistake by doing that in the way he framed what I think is a truth, that eventually we have to deal with the nuclear dimensions. Nonetheless, he was telegraphing at this moment of, I think, unprecedented tumult in Iranian society, we're not going to talk to the citizens now, we're only going to talk to the elites who will eventually crush what's going on. And that was a huge mistake.
Nader, you want to take one question for 45 seconds?
I'll take very quickly. On the whether Khamenei and Ahmadinejad become tougher, I think there's no question that they will become less open and more nervous about negotiating with the United States. Not least because I think, much as Afshin called Mousavi the accidental reformer, I think he was to them the unexpected reformer. I think to the extent that he was moved by the people in the streets and started saying things, and his wife started saying things that they didn't expect, I think they have become more nervous about the elite, and clearly having other clerics question them will make them more nervous. Just one quick point on the Obama effect. I think it's important that, the Lebanon elections, which happened soon after Cairo, to the extent that the administration said anything, they certainly did not try to beat back the impression that it somehow vindicated, was a reaction to, or reflected well on the speech, which I think, by the way, is a faulty analysis of what happened in Lebanon and with Hezbollah. But I think you can't have it both ways and then say, well, what happened in Iran has nothing to do with us. I think it's either one or the other. And again, I think whether that meddling would be getting into the question between Mousavi and Ahmadinejad, but addressing and honoring and reacting to the movement in the streets, which is about greater freedoms, really a separate issue than the election outcome, is something this president ought to have done.
In terms of what the Iranians will want to see from the U.S., they will want to see what, from their perspective, is a sign of real seriousness that the U.S. is interested in genuine strategic rapprochement with the Islamic Republic. They will have a very high bar for that. The bar was high before this episode. If anything, the bar coming out of this episode may be a little bit higher in that, they're going to want to see that a dialogue with the U.S. is going to be comprehensive, that it is aimed at strategic rapprochement. It's not going to be a repeat of what happened after 9/11, where they provide us with a lot of help on Afghanistan against al-Qaeda, and their reward is to be labeled part of the axis of evil, and then we unilaterally cut off the dialogue with them. They're not going to go down that road again. They liked some of Obama's rhetoric early on, but he's going to have to show them that there's real substance behind that for them to be willing to move forward. If we don't pass that seriousness test, they are prepared to ride this out. They don't need engagement with us. They think it would be optimal if they could move in that direction. But if they're not going to do it unless they are confident that it is going to head in the direction that really addresses strategic needs that they have. On Mousavi and the reform movement, let me say briefly, it is a real mistake to view Mousavi as a reformist. There was one reformist candidate on the ballot. It was Mr. Karoubi. Most reformists in Iran made a strategic decision to support Mousavi rather than Karoubi because they thought he was actually more winnable, that he could appeal to people more in the center, even pragmatic conservatives, and maybe form a broader coalition than Karoubi could ever have a chance of forming. Right now, the reformist trend in Iranian politics remains in serious disarray. It has been in disarray since the end of Khatami's presidency, which for all, in retrospect, we seem to remember Khatami fondly. I think for most Iranians, the Khatami presidency is viewed on the whole as a disappointment.
Afshin? This is actually, we're not going to have time for any more questions, so Afshin, you can go ahead and take a minute and a half.
Okay.
Fair.
You guys took a minute and a half, 3 minutes anyways.
No, reformists are in disarray, largely now because many of them are in jail. About 200 reformists have been picked up. Some of the leading lights of the reform movement have been jailed in the past few days. People taken out of their hospital beds and jailed. I heard news that Mohsen Mir Damadi, one of the hostage takers, who's then became a reformist, someone who I got to know when I was in Tehran and interviewed several times, was put in jail. The reformists are certainly in trouble. And how will they emerge from this? One of the things, it really remains to be seen what Mousavi will turn out to be. I do maintain post-election Mousavi is likely a different figure than pre-election Mousavi, but I don't know that for a fact. That remains to be seen. Khamenei, Ahmadinejad, the question of what will they do? Will they be more repressive? Khamenei is a man of power right now. But he was a revolutionary in the 1970s. And one of the lessons of the revolution of the 1970s that many men of power will tell you within the Islamic Republic right now is that when the Shah gave an inch, they wanted to take a mile. And when the Shah stood before Iranians and said, "I've heard your revolution," and he began jailing ministers, this emboldened them. And many Islamic Republic figures will tell you this. And so if you are in Khamenei's head, right now he's thinking, I cannot do anything that would give an inch. I do not want to embolden these people. So that's where I think Khamenei and Ahmadinejad are right now. And the last headline, I think, is what we've witnessed is the return of the Iranian middle class. the Iranian middle class were largely disappointed in Khatami's presidency, not so, partly because of Khatami, but partly because he was really pushed back and prevented from doing the things that he wanted to do. What we've seen in the 2005 election is that middle class largely absented itself from the voting process. They seem to have returned in 2009. The Iranian middle class were instrumental in making the 1979 revolution. Will they continue this? We just don't know.
I'd like to close by briefly with what I opened with, which is Ahmadinejad and Khomeini may remain in power, but the values that Iranians have across the board, their actions now are running counter to those values. So they even may risk alienating their own base of support. What the long-term consequences of that are, we do not know. But in the long term, we might be seeing the unraveling of the Islamic Republic. Not today, not tomorrow, but this is, I think, they may have overplayed their hands here, even among their supporters. At least that's what we found.
All right, everyone. Well, thanks for coming this afternoon, and thanks for the panel.